Hello and welcome back to Rev Real Estate School. I'm your host, Michael Montgomery, and today we're talking about social anxiety in real estate. How do we overcome it? What can we do if we're starting to feel social anxiety come on? And also we're going to look at traditional tips out there and see if they actually work in real estate. One of which is fake it until you make it. And then finally, we have an amazing resource for you if you want to explore this topic even further. So first off, when we are thinking about social anxiety, this is a very common feeling. This is very common all throughout society, but especially in real estate. Now, if you're feeling this and you are less than, say, 5 years in the industry, this is extremely normal. Almost every agent, as they're getting into this industry, they're going to feel some sense of social anxiety because they're going to be putting themselves in social situations that they're not traditionally used to. And the only types of people that tend to not feel social anxiety as they're getting into real estate are people that have very long, deep sales histories. So if they worked for a company and they had done sales for years and years, then potentially they may have a little bit less. But the majority of agents, and almost every agent I know, when they first get in, myself included, you are going to have a level of social anxiety. Almost every agent will have some aspect of this that will come into play as they're building their business. Now, the first thing that you can keep in mind is there is no mold of a real estate agent. The mold that you can think of when you're thinking of a traditional real estate agent tends to be that 90s realtor that drives a certain car, wears a certain watch, dresses a certain way, talks a certain way. Those ways are no longer the ways that sales occur. Nowadays, it's so much more focused on building these human connections and getting to know people even outside of real estate, which then builds more trust and actually makes our job so much more enjoyable as well. So one of the first things that you can keep in mind is you don't have to fit yourself into any type of mold. You can be unapologetically yourself and you can still absolutely crush it in real estate. But what we need to understand is there are ways that we can communicate in order to get our message across. But more than anything, what's holding us back is just the fact that we think that we need to act a certain way in order to be a real estate agent. And that could not be further from the truth. The traditional real estate agent and the way that we think of that real estate agent is no longer the way that most successful agents are going out there and talking with other clients. So understand that you can be yourself. It's easier said than done, right? To just say, go out there and be yourself. That's a lot more challenging to do in practice than it is to just say that. So how do we go about doing that? Well, the first thing that we need to understand is this concept of detaching from the outcome. And the more detached we can be from a certain outcome, typically the better that conversation will go. And so there's this concept of the more effort, the more that we try, typically the worse the conversation actually goes. So if we just detach from the outcome and we're not concerned about what the outcome is, then in fact the conversation tends to go a lot better. And we'll also tend to have less social anxiety around it. But how do we go about doing this? How do we go about starting to detach from the outcome? One of the best tips out there is start making calls, right? People will say start going out there and start making calls. But you don't want to go and exhaust your whole database and talking to people and trying to detach from the outcome and it's not necessarily working and you've gone through your whole database. So what can you do? Well, what you can do is you could end up starting to make calls in other areas. So you can call in different areas that aren't your general area of focus. So if you are working in a given city, you may decide to call numbers in different cities. And what you're doing here is you couldn't care less about the outcome. Because ultimately, you're not even looking for that business. That's not in your market. And so you are actually having conversations with people outside of your marketplace. So you will be detached from the outcome. Now, you will get yelled at. You will get people that will tell you never to call them again. But ultimately, you're going to build up this level of immunity because you are having these conversations and there's no outcome attached to it. And another strategy that you can use is you can start talking to people in our industry. So when you're talking to other realtors, when you're talking to lenders, home inspectors, lawyers, these people tend to be a lot easier for us to communicate with. And that's because there's really no outcome. Oftentimes, a lot of these people are looking to get our business. So they're the ones that may feel more social anxiety. So this can be a really good way for us to start talking about real estate with people in the industry where there's actually no attachment to the outcome because we're not looking for an outcome. Okay, but let's say that we are talking to a client. How can we go about actually getting away from this concept of social anxiety? Well, one thing that we can also focus on is not focusing on trying to secure the client. Instead, just focus on the next step. So if you are talking to a lead, we're not trying to convert that lead into a client. We're not trying to get that lead's listing on the phone. Instead, all we're trying to do is move the deal forward. So what would be the next logical step after that call? Very likely, if it's a listing lead, then we want to get into the house. And so what would be a successful call there is not getting somebody to sign a listing agreement over the phone. That doesn't happen. If that does happen to you, fantastic. I've never had that happen to me. Instead, we have to go meet the client. And so when we start to think about the whole transaction, we start to get a lot of anxiety. But if we're just thinking about the next step of this call, all we're trying to get out of this call is to set up a time for us to go visit the home, our anxiety will drop. And that's because what we have to accomplish becomes a lot easier for us to stomach than actually just trying to win this client over with one call, which doesn't actually happen. That's not the way it actually occurs. Now, what happens if we do get on this call though, and we don't know what to say? And we end up feeling these feelings of social anxiety come up in real estate. Well, what we can do is we can become just absolute ninjas at asking questions. And if you become very good at asking questions, then from there, you are taking the pressure off of yourself. So all you need to truly do is understand how to ask a good question. And then from there, the conversation will flow. So oftentimes we get up into our own heads, because we want to have the best answers. We want to come across a certain way. We want to be able to answer every single question that they could throw our way and then some. But instead, if we reverse that process and we are the ones asking the questions and the lead or the client is the one answering them, then our guard tends to drop. Because we are no longer feeling that anxiety of having to perform. Instead, what we're doing is we're asking questions of them. Now, in the description below, I'll link up some of my favorite questions. If you'd like to download those and use those, feel free to do so. But every time that I jump on a call, before I actually make that call, or anytime I go to an event, or anytime I'm doing an open house, I'm always having questions in advance. So I have questions ready to go. So if I was to meet somebody at an open house, I would already have a list of questions that I would ask them. For example, if I'm at the open house, I ask them, did they drive by and see the sign or did they see it online? Now, what that's going to tell me is if they're just kind of casually looking around or if they're actually targeting this property. And then I'm going to ask them, how's their search going so far? Which is then going to lead down the road of if they are currently working with an agent, because they'll say, oh, we've been out, we've seen a ton of homes. And when that would suggest that they're working with an agent, or they might say they're just getting started. And so now they might be somebody who could be a good potential lead for me. I'm doing that purely by way of questions. And I'm not actually adding anything beyond asking questions, trying to extract what they already have. Now, what happens if we're at that open house or we're at an event and we get this feeling like, oh, we should probably go talk to this person? What we'll start to do is we'll start to think through it. So we're going to start thinking through what should we say? What should we do? How should we act? How should we approach them? And what this is going to do is it's going to increase the amount of time between when we had the thought of when we wanted to talk to somebody and then when we actually go and talk to them. And so the larger this time gap, the more difficult it's going to be and the less likely that you will do it. There's this concept of this 5-second rule. I believe it's the 5-second rule. It's Mel Robbins, and she counts down from 5 and then she does something. And there's a lot of very interesting psychology built into this. And the whole concept behind it really is that we are shortening that time that we can actually talk ourselves out of something. What we're doing is we're giving ourselves 5 seconds to get over there and talk to somebody. And in doing that, we have less time for that anxiety to build, because the more time that we have, the more anxiety that will build. So when we have the feeling of going out there and we want to go talk to somebody, just go do it. Don't allow yourself to think too much about it, because the more that we think about it, the less likely it will occur. Next, when we are in these situations, and when we know we're going to be in a situation that could end up causing some level of social anxiety as a realtor, what can we do? What I would do is I'd focus on one very small thing. So I'd focus on one very small element of the conversation. And instead of focusing on having some large, perfect conversation, I just wanted to improve at one thing. And it's the same thing if you were improving in real estate. It's very hard for you to improve at everything at once. Instead, you might be focusing on CMAs. You might be focusing on building out your social strategy. And it's the same thing when it comes to conversational skills. So as a first step, what we can do is if we're working on one small thing, the first small thing is just putting ourselves in social situations. All we want out of this is to put ourselves in the position. We do not have to be perfect in the conversation. From there, we've already been successful because that is our first step. And then when we get into it, we want to be able to ask a few questions. And we may want to be able to respond to a few questions. And we may want to crack a joke. And we may want to continue the conversation outside of where I'm meeting the person. And so we can expand upon this, but just focus on one small thing. And if you're feeling social anxiety, the first thing is just putting yourself in more social circumstances, which then leads us to this topic of fake it until you make it. Does this work? Well, the answer is yes, it absolutely does work. We can't think our way out of social anxiety. We can understand that there is a level of our thinking that will play into it. And there's actually a fantastic resource for you on this. Down the description below, there's a 7-module course on YouTube. It's totally free, and there's no affiliation with this individual, but he has this great course walking us through the mental side of social anxiety. Highly suggest everybody goes through these videos. Now, there is that element to it, but we're not going to improve until we actually start socializing. And so the concept of fake it until you make it actually is quite helpful in this case because we have to be able to put ourselves in these positions. It's the same thing in real estate. I'm not going to become great at talking to leads by just practicing scripts in front of the mirror. I'm going to have to eventually talk with somebody or talk to a lead in order to improve. And it's the same thing with social anxiety. We have to start putting ourselves in these positions. Now, not in extreme positions where we're going to feel like we're going to snap, but more like a rubber band where we're stretching it, where it's becoming a little bit uncomfortable. And then it's okay. Then we can go back to our safe place. And then when we go to the next event, we're stretching it a little further. What we're going to be doing here is we are going to be faking it until we make it, because that does end up helping tremendously when it comes to real estate and social anxiety. Also understand that it's perfectly acceptable to get help. And a personal story, I have had a psychologist in Calgary, and we helped this psychologist buy and sell real estate. It's true. And I had this person because I wanted to work on myself. In real estate, our ability to handle social anxiety and to handle difficult situations is extremely important. And so I invested in this psychologist to help me through this. And through there, that actually led to a real estate transaction. So it's quite funny how this can all end up working. But do not hesitate to get help. We need to be on our game in real estate, and we need to understand that this is a process. Now, if we're less than 5 years, as we said off the start, this is extremely normal. Even if we're 5 to 25 years, this is extremely normal. There are times where I feel this all the time as well, but I come back to my strategies, and it's okay to feel like this. There's a lot of people out there that do. And if we want to get help, it's definitely worth the investment, because how we communicate and how we socialize is a huge element of how we grow our business. Thank you very much for watching or listening to this episode. Remember, you can reach out to me anytime on Instagram. I'm at the.michael.montgomery, or head over to revrealestateschool.com. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next lesson.